God's not boring, but that he is so excited about the opportunity to enjoy life through you. So today, what I enjoy about the whole day session like this is often we only have an opportunity to give you the conclusions of the thoughts and the meditation and the study that we've done, but having a day like today means that we can actually unpack the thought patterns, the arguments, go into the scriptures and look at the whole story that brings us to these beautiful conclusions. And for us, it's just such a privilege to share our lives with you, because you know, in fact, 1 John says it so clearly. It is our relationship with God is not some otherworldly, private encounter only. John makes it quite clear that the place where you're going to encounter God more than anywhere else is in human faces, is in other people. And so what a moment we have to encounter him, for us to encounter him in you, for you to encounter him in one another and in us. We are made for events, moments like this, moments of encounter. And so I want to, is this working fine? You all hearing that all right? I want to maybe also make, sorry, I just remembered. I wanted the sound recording of this because I haven't posted the audio for a little while. Excuse me. There we go. So I thought I'm going to start off with just sharing a little bit. Well, I didn't even plan this. It's actually as I just sat there and thought, here we are in this, it's not North Dakota, it is Minnesota. I kind of thought of what brought us, and how unlikely it was for this. Suddenly I saw myself as a 8-year-old boy in a small little town on the edge of the border of South Africa, on the northern border. We lived in a small little mining community, and most of my home language was Afrikaans. So I didn't even speak English really until I left school and met Mary Ann, and I would acquire any language to try and tell her how I felt. And then I suddenly just remembered one of the earliest events. Now, there was an earlier event, I remember, even much younger. I wasn't even in school yet, where I just lay out on the lawn, looked up, just in wonder, where did all this stuff come from? And I remember asking my dad, where did I come from? And he kind of explained from mom and me, and where did you come from my mom, and where did the world come from? And eventually it got to God, but where did God come from? And he just said, no one gave birth to God, he just is. And amazingly, for my 4 or 5-year-old mind, that was sufficient. So God has no beginning, he's got no end, he just is. He's the one that sustains all of us in existence. And then a few years later, I must have been about 8, we went to a Pentecostal church, and I was just very naughty. in the church. So I can just remember getting hidings. And in those days, it was quite fine to slap your child properly. So every now and then, Dad would take me out of church because I wasn't quiet enough and just give me a good walloping. So I didn't enjoy church at all. It wasn't fun for me. I remember in this hot, Palaborva was the town name. It was so hot. I permanently walked without a shirt, just shorts, no shoes or shirt. It was hot throughout the year. I thought seasons is the kind of thing you learn at that school like maths. It's just theoretical because I've never seen it. But one day I was in the church and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I was on the edge, which was wonderful. I could just slip out and I ran, and I knew my dad was going to try and catch me. But I ran for the back door, and he was behind me, and I ran and I went over the road, and as I went over, a bicycle hit me and went over my nose. And that was the first time I broke my nose. But church wasn't ever something that was very fun to me. But then there were moments in which God would just so beautifully reveal himself. And on one of these children's camps, all the children went, maybe 40 or 50 of us, out in the veld, the bush, and we had a children's camp. And we had a lady that came with these strange new teachings that, God is still able to heal, to do amazing things in your life. He is relevant. He's alive. And she was very engaging in the story she told. And suddenly I heard my brother calling me, Andre. And as I looked behind, the reason he called me is there was a scorpion, and it was quite a dangerous scorpion. It was known that people could die from the shock of the pain that it caused, whether young children or if you're a bit weak. And I was young, and he called me, and as he called me, I put my hand right on the scorpion. And boy, the pain. We still had a recording of it for a long time. I started screaming uncontrollably. And they just grabbed me and started praying. And in this moment, I was just gone. And all I can remember is it was just hazy. And out of this haze, I just knew it was Jesus. He just stood in front of me. His one hand was empty, and he stretched it out, and his other hand had this gift all wrapped up. And he said, do you want to come and be with me? Or do you want to have this gift of healing? And I just knew, of course, I'm 8 years old. I'm not going to quit on life now. And as I reached out to the gift, and you can still hear it in the recording, this hysterical scream just went, oh. And the people who were actually looking saw my hand had swollen very thick, and it just immediately went, gone. And so I suddenly started realizing, wow, God's still involved in this world. God's still active and ready to do stuff. And a strange thing that happened then is I got some cassette tapes, Freedom from Fear, which would have been totally irrelevant for me because it's English. And I'm Afrikaans speaking, but it was part of the word of faith kind of messages that became popular. And so I started listening to these cassette tapes in a foreign language at the age of 9, 10, until I could repeat them off by heart, although I didn't really know what I was saying. I started getting an idea what the words meant, and I found a couple in town that had a lot of Word of Faith videos, and I would I remember I was 11 at that stage. I would go, it was just crazy. An 11-year-old that wants to come and watch videos of people preaching, but somehow something connected, that there's a truth here. And so by the time I was 15, and you go, I don't know, you probably have had this in your Christian life, this up and down experience where God is with me. Ah, look at that. Wow, come in. I must first hug you. Oh, good to see that. Have a break and encounter God. Welcome. And so by the time I was 15, I had this up and down Christian experience, and I thought, I'm so tired of trying to impress God more, and I became very much aware of the importance of my words and speak just right and act just right. And I came to a stage where I thought, either this is going to work fully for me, or I'm just going to drop this whole thing. And so in my desperation, I thought, if I can just sin less, if I can just be holier, if I can just impress God with my discipline, surely He'll be closer. Surely He will do more stuff with me and through me. And there were moments of beautiful breakthrough that I'll tell you about now. But one day I just fell on my bed totally disappointed that I have messed up again. And just as I thought I was getting closer where God was going to do extraordinary things for me, there I go and mess up. And in my absolute disappointment, I thought God would be at least as disappointed in me as I am. And in that moment, I suddenly became aware of Jesus just standing at the edge of my bed. And what surprised me is the favor, just a smile of absolute approval. And it shocked me, because surely you've got to be as disappointed as I am in how I've acted, if not more. And he immediately reminded me of that scripture in Romans 8, what we could not do because of the weakness of the flesh. God did in sending His own Son. And I suddenly knew what that meant for me, my effort to get closer to God, to be more like Jesus, was suddenly totally invalidated by the revelation that God became you. Stop trying to become more like Him. He has bridged the distance that we could never bridge. He has closed that gap. He has come as close as He can possibly be. And I realized that this love I could never avoid. Even if I ran from it, He would pursue me the way He has always pursued me. And that was the day I just fell in love. And that experience of falling in love with God suddenly made sin and all the other stuff irrelevant. Because it was no longer the focus. There was no longer this discipline of, I must try and not do that, When you fall in love, you don't try not to spend too much time somewhere else. It's just natural that this is the only place I want to be. This is the only company I want to enjoy. And so that experience started setting the pace for understanding that God is much more, well, let me say it another way. God is much less like truth you have to believe, and much more like beauty you fall in love with. And obviously there's truth in this beauty, but it's not the kind of truth that you're going to summarize in 3 principles and 5 steps. And it's the truth of the beauty that cannot be defined, that cannot fit into language. Mary Ann and myself met 3 years later, got married about 3-4 months after that. It would have been 3 weeks if it was up to me, but I said, how long does it take to organize a wedding? I mean, 3 weeks? And she said, maybe 3 months. Don't know, never done this before. And we started just traveling into Africa. And what a joy to discover a God who's ready to reveal himself. Even I remember my last year at school, we were in a very conservative town, most were Dutch Reformed, where the gifts and those things aren't even, people have no grid for that. And during the exams, there was a few hours where people could just study, and the teacher slipped out, and one of the guys came to me and said, "Oh yeah, you can speak in tongues." I said, "Yeah." And he jumped up and said, "Hey guys, Andre's going to speak in tongues for us. Go and listen." And they all gave it, and I said, that's not really what it's about, but it's not for entertainment, but I tell you what, is there anybody here that's sick? And our first team Rabe player, he contacted me just the other day again. He strained his back so much that he could hardly move, and he couldn't play for our team. And he said, "Yeah, I can't bend." And I just started praying in tongues for him and said, now touch your toes. And his eyes just got bigger and bigger as he touched his toes, and God just beautifully healed him. We then, after we got married, we traveled into Africa, and again just saw God's willingness to meet people where they're at, to make known to them that He is not far away, that He is right there in your existence, experiencing everything you experience, and ready to transform life into the beauty it's meant for. And I can't but see the significance of, you mentioned almost 5 years ago, in fact it was October 2010, we went back into normal life. I did computer programming, etc. And during that time, for a couple of years, I'd be praying, saying, "Lord, we want to go back doing ministry." Maybe I must just tell one of the things that happened in Zimbabwe or something. I think while I'm busy with the story or not. We had fun with God. It was such fun. We would wake up in the morning, just pray, "Lord, where should we go?" And we'd hear Swaziland. Okay, that's a neighboring country. And so we'd just pack up a bit of clothing, get in the car, and as we drove out our driveway, a neighbor stopped us and said, "Where are you going?" And we said, "Swaziland." "Oh, where?" "I don't know, we just kind of prayed and felt the Lord said Swaziland." And she said, "That's interesting. I met a missionary from Swaziland at a conference, a few weeks ago. This is his name, Peter McDonald or whatever." She gave us the piece of paper. We drove into the country, Swaziland, stopped at the first cafe in the first town, and as we ordered something to drink, we asked the waiter, "Do you by any chance know this person?" Yes, he lives upstairs. We didn't have Facebook or any other ways of communication. You really had to depend on the Lord drawing you. And I had a wonderful time with them. But then in October 2010, we were praying for a while, Lord, we want to go again. We want to, this message is bubbling over, and continually just felt the Lord saying, what I share with you is not for the purpose of you sharing it with someone else firstly. What I share with you is first and foremost for your enjoyment. Why do you want to share something if you don't enjoy it? No, do you want other people to be as miserable as you are? So, first and foremost, what you hear, enjoy. What I show you, enter into the full embrace and beauty and significance of what it is. And so the Lord's been saying this to me for a while, but I still just wanted to go. And then one day I said, Lord, I am enjoying, really, I'm enjoying what you show, but I'm enjoying it so much that I just can't stay here anymore. I need to share it. So I'm going. Are you coming with? And it was so as if the Lord said, you ready? And I said, well, where should we go? And the name Budapest just fell into my mind, and I thought, we've never been to Budapest. I know nothing about Budapest, but if this is what you want me to do, can you just... No one knew us. We knew nobody really. We weren't traveling, ministering or anything. But if this is where you wanted, can you somehow connect me with someone? And later that day, I got an email from a person that said, you don't know me, but I've seen you've published your latest book, Imagine. And I want to get a hold of that. How do I get a hold of it in Budapest? I thought, here's our chance. So I emailed back and said, what are you doing this Saturday? We'll deliver it. And I remember he came back and said, I'm not a pastor or anything, I just want the book. I said, that's fine, we can meet at the coffee shop and just chat. And so we flew over the next weekend and spent 6 hours conversing with this amazing brother. Our first mission together out of England again after many years. And there he is, Joseph. And we had the most amazing time just conversing, and Joseph started opening up opportunities throughout Hungary. We went into Szeged prison, we went into different churches, different home groups, different places. So for the next few months we were in and out of Hungary all the time. So many beautiful memories. And that all is just the introduction to where my thoughts went of, here we are today. Here Joseph is as well. And how this message propels us. And the thought that I'm going to develop today is just the wonder, the significance, the meaning of what it means to be human. The wonder of you. Why did God bother creating anything? I mean, if he was complete and full, satisfied from the very beginning, why all this? Or as David said, what is man with your mind full of Him. Now, many, especially within religious language, our sense of self has so many definitions around it. And from an earliest age, we are taught to define ourselves more accurately and more certainly, because it seems like somehow we find security in the idea that we are right, that we are certain, that we know ourselves. But what is this self you are aware of? Where did it begin? If you think of your earliest memories as a young child, try and think, what is the first thing you've ever remembered? The first time you became self-conscious. Now, maybe that memory it's normally a process that develops over a long period of time. But can you see, even in that simple illustration, that there was a time where you were not aware of yourself? That you lived, you cried, you ate, you did all the things, but there's no recollection. There was no self-awareness. The self is something that began to form. Now, many of us, I think it's Spinoza that said, people consider themselves free because they are conscious of their own decisions and their own desires. But they remain ignorant of the influences, and because they're ignorant, they remain in bondage to the influences that causes you to decide and desire the way you decide and desire. So there are unconscious influences and movements that motivates the way we think, how we desire, and what we believe. And that is very uncomfortable for us to often acknowledge. This is a bit of an echo. Can we, is it? Okay, so it's maybe just me. Okay. Okay, fine. Get used to it.
Maybe you need to listen to yourself.
Should. So to become aware of the unconscious influences that drives us can be very uncomfortable, because one of the things that probably influences us beyond what we realize is the whole Western philosophy of what makes you, you. It is what Descartes, the philosopher, is famous for saying, I think, therefore I am. He brought about the idea that you are an independent, autonomous, self-sufficient being. You are what you decide you are. You need no one else and nothing else to be yourself. So the very individualistic freedom, so let me write it here, autonomous, in other words, I need no one else or nothing else to be me. I am in myself all that I can be. It's like a well-defined, and the more we define ourselves, the more we are certain of who we are. And we've got such a obsession from an early age to know ourselves, to define ourselves, and to strengthen our borders. Because the stronger our borders, the more certain our definitions, the more secure we feel. And so this, and independent. I don't need anything or anyone else to be myself. That is an idea, a philosophy that is very popular in our Western world. Why? Because it promises security. It says you don't need anyone else to be yourself. It promises control, that you are in control of your own thoughts, of who you are, of what happens in life. And isn't it quite appealing, the idea that I'm in control, that I need nothing and no one else to be myself? That's very appealing, but there's some very serious flaws in that whole way of thinking. First of all, of course, there's stuff that you can influence in your life. But the reality is you are not in control of most things that has formed you, that has made you, that has brought you about. You're just not in control. That's not the easy thought to get used to, but yes, you've got some influence, but you're definitely not in complete control of who and what you are. And so it promises freedom. It promises, so let me write that down, promises freedom. It promises control. It means I need no one. And those are all very appealing promises. But what that, and so how we go about life is we continue to define ourselves more clearly, more strongly, and we find our security and our identity in being right. I am right. And therefore you develop a strong sense of identity. Now, we've ministered and spoken on identity for many years, but it has undergone such a dramatic transformation in the past few years as we started looking deeper into what makes you human. And so I want to start proposing today something very different. Something that totally redefines what it means to be human. And I'm not going to give it a very clear border, because it's not very well defined. But you know what the benefit is of that, where you are not well defined? Certainty eliminates possibility. A possibility can never be reduced to a certainty. When you become totally convinced about who and what you are, and that is what we try and do throughout life. I just want to find my true self and be it. And we pursue that perfect definition of what makes me me. The closer you move to a perfect definition of who you are, the closer you move to being perfectly boring. Because there's nothing more to be discovered, nothing more to be. But if the borders are a bit more porous, it's a bit more uncertain, I want to start looking at how we are formed. Each one of us, do you realize, did not have our beginning in isolation. All of us began because of the intimate relationship of others. So from your very beginning, you are a being that began in relationship, and you continue to be formed within relational movements. And so, let's say that is a mother figure and the father figure, and there's siblings. So what we see here is we've got likeness, but we also have otherness. A young child that is born from the earliest moments of self-awareness, it is formed within this relationship where the child only has eyes for mom and mom only has eyes for the child, and the child recognizes another which is like itself. Our reflective nature is something that they've studied from newborn babies that are able to imitate facial expressions the minutes after they are born. How does a newborn baby that has never even seen itself in a mirror know that that funny protruding thing called a mouth equals this mouth? From the moment of birth, humans are able to imitate. They are able to recognize likeness and reflect it. And the self begins to form in this environment in which there is both otherness and likeness. Just want to grab my iPad quick. I want to read you a quote. No one ever thought of naming the force of gravity until Newton, because this force was so prevalent, it was so obvious, that it was so in your face that no one ever thought of explaining it or exploring it until one day, as the legend goes, the apple fell on his head. And he thought, what caused the apple? What is the force that attracts it to go downwards? And so he developed the whole theory of gravity, this force of attraction. Now, in the same way, there's a force that makes us human, that is so present and so in our face that for many generations we've never thought of actually naming it. And this Jean-Paul Augélien wrote the following. He says, "To my knowledge, no one has ever thought of naming the force that draws the child into reproducing what the adult says or does. This force of attraction, of interest, of attention, so much of it taken for granted, so much of it is part of the fabric of humanity. A young child has no power to resist this attraction. To feel such attraction is the child's very nature, to the degree that he or she is normal. A child lacking this capacity would be deprived of something basic to his humanity. He would become isolated, autistic. The natural force of cohesion, which alone grants access to the social, to language, to culture, and indeed to humanness itself, is simultaneously mysterious and obvious, hidden in and of itself but dazzling in its effects, like gravity and the attraction of corporeal masses in Newtonian space. If gravity did not exist, life on Earth would not be possible. Without it, there would be chaos. Similarly, if the remarkable force that attracts human beings to one another, that unites them, that enables children to model themselves on adults, that makes possible their full ontogenesis, the acquisition of language, if this force did not exist, there would be no mankind. That's from the Puppets of Desire, from Jean-Michel Augélien. So what he's saying is, what is the force, just like the sun, the moon, the earth, spins around one another. They attracted to one another, but it's the very force that attracts and repels that makes them uniquely themselves. What is the force that flows between humans that makes us human? In other words, something is flowing here. There's a force of relational movements between people. What is that force? I'm going to call that force mimesis. Now, mimesis, it's where we get the word mimic, imitate from. It's our ability to reflect. Now, let me give you some more examples from children. The first time the neurological basis for this is what they call mirror cells or mirror neurons. And they discovered that quite by accident when they were doing tests on monkeys and tried to work out what neurons fire when they reach for a peanut and eat it. And during one of the breaks, a researcher walked past, grabbed some peanuts, and all the machines went off. And they discovered that almost the exact same neurons fire when they perform an act as when they observe an act. And so when they took these tests and started doing it on humans and found that we have a reflective capacity way beyond any other animal. In one of the tests that they did, they would take a young child, 1.5 years old, and they would have an adult attempt to disassemble a toy. But at some stages even fail at the attempt of disassembling this toy. Then leave the toy with the child. The immediate thing that the child will do is to attempt to reach the same goal of disassembling that toy. In other words, this 1.5-year-old somehow reflected not just the actions of the person he observed, he reflected the intentions, the desires. How is it that a young child like that can enter another person's mind, know what they intend to do, and imitate that intention? In other words, the human capacity to reflect goes way beyond monkey see, monkey do. We have the capacity continually and unconsciously to reflect one another's intentions. And of all the qualities we reflect, intention is the most subtle and subconscious, and we're going to see why. But what happens in this process from a very early age where the baby only has eyes for mom and mom only has eyes for the child, they start in this place of otherness and likeness to imitate, to reflect. Now, let me just draw that further. A being which by its very definition is a reflection, which is what Genesis 1 tells us, you are the image, the likeness of the invisible God. Our very definition is a being that image, a being that reflects. In other words, if I take a mirror, that mirror doesn't just reflect an image without something else than the mirror. It needs a reference beyond itself to reflect. And so as human beings, we are designed with the capacity to be what we behold. And the implications is enormous, because it means that I am not myself by myself. I am intertwined with the otherness of other people. There are reflective relational movements that continually flows between people, and it's the very movement of these relational movements that carves us and that forms us. Now, at first, this idea that I am a reflection and I am intertwined with others might feel a little bit uncomfortable. Why? Because it means I'm not totally in control. It means that I am actually more dependent on others for who I am than what I would like to admit. It means that, you see, in this definition, my freedom is all isolated within myself, and other people just become an obstacle to my freedom. They become a limitation to who I want to be. But in this definition, suddenly something new happens. Suddenly we see that what makes me me are these relational movements, and therefore my freedom finds opportunity in others. Let me say something that will make this more relevant. So if we have, there's a lot of relational movements between you and a loved one, a parent, and then suddenly that loved one passes away. Why does it affect us so deeply? Because if this person is suddenly gone, many of the relational movements that has formed you are gone in a way as well. And so you are not just losing something external to yourself. It is such a personal loss because you are losing something of yourself. Because it's those very relational movements that has formed you. And so in this definition, freedom takes on a whole new definition. How we define ourselves becomes a whole new definition. And the portion that I want to focus on is how desire specifically is a quality that is most unconscious and that plays a big role in our early development and self-awareness. Have you ever heard children running to a toy and saying, "I saw that first"? Now, what they've done, more experiments, they've taken children again about 1.5 years old, and the adults would get their attention and then look away at another object, and all the children would follow the gaze of the adult. They would repeat the experiment, but they would close their eyes before they look away, and most of the children would not follow their head movement. There's something about our gaze that gives value to what we are looking at. There's something that communicates this is precious, this is desirable. And so from the earliest moments of child development, desires are suggested by the smallest of actions, like a gaze, can communicate to the child, this is desirable. Now, why would the child come to a place where they say, I saw it first? Because this very act in which desire is mediated, there comes a time in the child's life where it deliberately refuses to acknowledge that this desire was suggested to me by another. And it claims that this desire began in me. I saw it first. No one else suggested to me that this was desirable. I saw it first. And so the very beginning of self-awareness begins in a kind of deception where we claim that we are the owners of our own desires. We possess our own decisions, our own desires, our own beliefs. And it's almost a necessary deception for the self to begin to form. I want to read you. Now, they've done so many studies on this, and there's a book called Mimesis and Science. And we're going to get to how this relates to you and the gospel, which is such good news. So you just need to bear with me through these fun facts. But in this book, Mimesis and Science, they said, researchers also note how difficult it is for most people to believe that they are imitating and being influenced by others in such broad and automatic ways. Even when they are presented with evidence that indicates otherwise, the tendency to deny our imitative behavior may be due to its non-conscious operation, combined with the fact that such knowledge threatens the notion of ourselves as being primary conscious and in control. And so this is just a piece that's from the Desire Found Me book. Claiming, the child that says, I saw it first. Claiming these desires as our own is part of the process of differentiating ourselves from others. The very origin of this self is therefore one of fundamental ignorance or even deceptions, for in claiming these desires as originating in and belonging to self, we do not recognize the process by which they were suggested to us. The further formation of this self will continue in this fundamental error of claiming ownership and perceiving itself as the origin of its beliefs and wants. As we mature, we enter a sphere where desires are communicated to us by a variety of ways, not only by those closest to us, but also by the cultures and communities we find ourselves in. In order to maintain a stable sense of self, we continue in the conviction that self is the originator of our desires, not realizing that desire is suggested to us by others. Of all the qualities that we reflect, desire is the quality whose movements are most elusive. You don't realize where it comes from until it's there. You suddenly desire something, but you don't know how that desire came to be there. Now, this fundamentally starts changing the way in which we understand how we are formed, how desire forms us, how we are influenced by others. I wanted to remember just give you that last bit as well. Sorry, I meant to just add this. Mimetic desire has huge implications, for it means that desire is not produced individually, but rather it has its origin in relationship. Desire constantly moves in the spaces between us, and by its very movement carves and energizes our characters. Desire is not created by self, but rather self is formed by desire. That means that you are not the sole source of your desires, but rather you have your origin in the desires that formed you. Self is therefore not the independent substance or reality that exists by itself, but rather it is the self of desire. It's a dynamic construct that is continually deconstructed and reconstructed. Now, this might almost feel like, whoa, we're going into unstable ground where I don't quite know who or what I am, but what it also does is it opens up possibilities of being that are not there when you've already decided clearly who and what I am. Because there's a stage in our development where we allow our experiences to teach us about ourselves, about others, about God. But there comes a place in our lives where we change the teacher-student relationship and we suddenly start teaching experiences what they really mean. Because we've now made up our mind who and what we are. That self of desire, or what psychologists would call the self of feeling, is the most primordial, the most fundamental sense of self. That self has got no consciousness of past or future. It is just conscious of, I desire. I feel. A baby doesn't reason itself into consciousness. It just feels hungry and it's going to shout until that hunger is fulfilled. So the self of feeling is the most fundamental self. But what develops after that is what they call the autobiographical self. What is this self? This is the self that as we go through life, we have these many experiences because we all encounter different events. But two people can be present in the exact same event but experience it very differently. Why? Because we all take the raw data, the information that is presented to us, and we break it down and then we reconstruct it. Now, if you've ever worked with photographic software, you know that you can put a certain effect on a photo. And it's probably one of the processes that's most power hungry, that really makes your computer get hot if you do that on a video or something like that. You put a certain effect on all these images. Now there's a place in life where we get to where we kind of make up our minds about who we are, what life is about, and we've interpreted these events in a certain way. And from that moment onwards, we're going to apply that effect to every new experience and to every new event that happens in our lives. Because we don't experience events objectively. Of course, events happen objectively, but the fact that we can experience it differently means that we are individually involved in creating the reality that we experience. So let me say it another way. We all live in the reality of our own illusions. You live in the reality of how you interpret life, of how you interpret events. You partake in creating your reality. You're not in control of it all, but you definitely participate in creating that reality. Now, as we have these experiences through life, we constantly look for meaning. We constantly look for, are these just scattered events, or is there a story? Is there a meaning behind all of this? And as we try to find this thread that stitches all the events together, we find that there's nothing more common to all our memories than the I that remembers them. There's nothing more common to all those images, all those events that happened that I experienced than the I that experienced them. And so we start finding ourselves in the story we tell ourselves. That becomes another definition. This is me. This is my story. And every new event, every new bit of information now needs to confirm that story. That's why we don't deal well with contradiction. Because in a way, contradiction doesn't contradict just facts or ideas. It actually contradicts me. Are you trying to weaken my borders? No, this is the story I've always been telling myself. If this story is not true, then who am I? Now, we don't go through that consciously, but unconsciously, when our stories are challenged, we get nervous because we're losing our borders. But you know what? These borders, although it promised freedom and control, become borders that isolates you. These borders becomes borders that limits you. And that's the very reason why they need to be erased. Because for you to be all you are meant to be, you don't just need another definition of who you are. You need some of the definitions removed in order to be expanded. And so as we tell ourselves that story and we start finding ourselves in that story, and we, no matter what new event, what new information is presented to us, we are extraordinarily talented in taking an event that contradicts everything I believe, deconstructing it, reconstructing it in a way that it confirms all that I've always believed. Have you ever noticed how right you are? Hey? I mean, if other people could just think like you, this world would be perfect, isn't it? I mean, you're never consciously wrong. And that is part of this egotistical self that wants to put borders of how right I am. And most definitely in this picture, your security is found in how right you are, how right your story is, how right your definitions are, how right your convictions are. But when you discover that it is relationship that forms you, you discover that your security and your sense of identity lies not in how right you are, but it lies in how loved you are. You discover that there's another force that defines me. I am who I am, not because of how I think. As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. No, I am what I am because I am loved. I love, therefore I am. Because you know what? Other people can do your thinking for you. But no one else can do your loving for you. Love, the way in which you love, you alone can do. And so it is love that defines you individually more than beliefs. Now I know we've come from, the Pentecostal kind of background where we do things, work hard to please God, and we find ourselves in our activity. And what a joy to come into the, so we call it the grace movement, that understands that it's not all my doing that pleases God, that He has done it, and I've just got to accept it and realize it and believe it. And that's true, but what have we done often is we have just made faith as much of a work as the other activities. We've made right believing the new thing that you must do that will save you. And I think God is drawing us deeper to the very foundational force that inspires us to believe right. Not just because of new information presented to us, but when we find ourselves loved. And that is what we'll go into the next session. Or what should I do? Shall I just carry on? When was going to be the break going to be?
Oh, what time is it?
11:40.
What were you thinking? What do you? 12. Yeah, 12.
Okay, let me go for another 20 minutes. I'll try and get as much in there. So, when I start discovering that love defines me more than my thinking, more than my faith, then I'm starting to tap into the very underlying force that forms me. And what we want to discover is if it is desire that forms us, what is the original desire that brought you into being? Let me quickly give you an example of the difference between need and desire. You know, if I talk a lot, I need some water. Or I need anything to drink, really. Tea would do as well. It's sometimes better because it's hotter. Sometimes it's not because it's finished. But when you need something, when I'm thirsty, anything wet that will quench my thirst will do. But if I wake up in the morning and I suddenly think of my favorite coffee brewing spot where they roast the coffee fresh, I can almost smell it. And they grind it just before they pour it. And it is just, that's the coffee I want. That desire precedes any need. It's not because I'm thirsty. I just desire coffee. And because I desire it, nothing else is going to satisfy except that coffee. Are you ready for very good news?
Yes.
You are completely and utterly unnecessary. There was no need within God that meant that you had to be created to fulfill His need. You are not this creation is not the product of a needy God. Ephesians 1 tells us that this God only does what He desires, what pleases Him. In other words, this God who was complete, full, satisfied from the very beginning, the God who is too much, overflows into a creation that is pure grace. There's nothing necessary for God about creation. Yet He creates. Why? Because He wants to. You were birthed not in a need within God, but you were birthed as a desire that came out of fullness. This God who continually imagines new ways of being Himself. Why? Because He is the God of infinite possibilities. Remember, Jesus said, there is nothing that is impossible for God. In other words, He's the God of possibilities. We've made Him so boring and stagnant. with our ideas of a sovereign God who has already decided exactly how everything's going to be from beginning to end. If God is absolutely certain and has determined how everything's going to be, then He is the God of no possibility. But He is the God of infinite possibilities. And so this God in His fullness, this God of infinite possibilities, imagines and desires unique possibilities of being Himself. And Ephesians 1 verse 4 says, He imagines you. He knows you by name. Before the very foundation of this world, before creation, before you have any opportunity to impress Him or to disappoint Him, He knows something about you that awakens His desire. And says, this thought needs to become flesh. This dream is too good to remain abstract. No, this word will become flesh. And so incarnation, this act of God's thoughts becoming flesh, does not happen for the first time in the person of Jesus. It happens as this universe bursts into existence. And the God who is the source of all creation expresses Himself in pure grace. And this is why the fact that you are not a need, you are a desire, means that that's why only you will satisfy.
That's good news.
It is good news. The good news is you are unnecessary, but you are desired. Wouldn't you rather be desired than needed? A need can be fulfilled and then replaced with many others that can fulfill the same need. But when you are desired, no one else fulfills that desire but you. So to say it another way, you are desired. Now we're getting back to that original question we asked in the beginning. Who am I? What is the self I am aware of? And we realize that we are going to get closer to an answer if we replace that question with 3 other questions that are much more informative. Question number 1 is, what do I desire? Question number 2 is, where does that desire come from? I'm going to stop at those 2 questions for now.
Leave everybody in suspense.
Yeah. And we're starting to move towards this understanding that you are not the product of a need. You are the product of a God who desires. And this God's desire is His creative ability to sustain in existence all that exists. We spoke about it the other night, Thursday night, with Pat and Pam at the very place, but I just want to touch on it, just the very way in which we understand God, not as some separate entity somewhere out there who just looks down on us and decides which ones will I love and which ones will I punish. I can confidently say that such a being does not exist. In fact, in that instance, I can agree with most atheists that I also don't believe in the God you don't believe in. But you just don't take it far enough. Yes, God does not exist as a being amongst other beings, but He is the source of all existence and the source of all being. And so even as science provides us with such beautiful metaphors, and string theory tells us that all of matter, all of physical matter is just sound energy. String theory tells us that every element has a different frequency. And the different frequencies produce different elements, produce different forms. And so all of creation is just a symphony. You are sound that I can see instead of hear. But what makes you you is sound. And I can't but think of Hebrews 1 verse 3 that says, He upholds all things by the sound, by the voice, by the word of His power. But what makes every element vibrate within your body, every frequency of every atom, is the voice of God sustaining you in existence. That means that creation doesn't just refer to an event that happened in the past. Rather, creation speaks about an ongoing relationship between the God who continually speaks you into existence and you. And so even the words existence and the words being are too small to describe this God. Because before anything existed, and before there were any beings, He is. But the way in which He exists is through what He gives existence. And the way in which God has being is through the beings He sustains. Now, why did I say all of that? I want to bring it back to this one thought. You are formed by desire. Now, you might have had many desires miscommunicated, misinterpreted in your environment, in your growing up, in your relationships with people. But the gospel comes to communicate to you the most authentic, the most original desire that gave you birth. And that is, God imagined you, desired you, and loved you into existence. And you exist from moment to moment because you are desired. Isn't that fun? You are desired. Now in the next session, we'll get into the scriptures to see if all of this waffle has got the biblical background. And we're going to enjoy that part as well. So how long do we have a break?